My name is Sophie Bridgers. I am a Simons postdoctoral fellow at MIT, where I work with Laura Schultz and with Tomer Ullman at Harvard. My talk today is titled Loopholes, a Window into Value Alignment and the Learning of Meaning. Imagine you have a child who is jumping on a couch. So you come in and say, "Don't jump on that couch." And what do? Well, they stop jumping on that couch and start jumping on the other one. This is what we mean by loophole behavior, intentionally acting on a possible but unintended interpretation of another person's request. And loopholes crop up all over the place. There are online forums with thousands of members sharing stories of malicious compliance. There are entire areas of law and legal studies devoted to letter versus spirit and form versus substance distinctions. Intentional misunderstandings are prominent in art and fable. In one of the oldest European folk tales, a smith outsmarts the devil using a loophole. And loopholes are also a problem for artificial intelligence, where machines do what you say, but not what you want. This is a simulated robot that was supposed to learn to walk, but figured out instead how to hook its legs together and slide along the ground. Now, these algorithms aren't intentionally finding loopholes, though we often joke that they are, but intentional loophole seeking is a hallmark of childhood. In fact, given that children seem to so nimbly understand linguistic ambiguity that they can even exploit it for their own ends, it's quite surprising that machines run into so much trouble. And though examples of machine loopholes can be amusing, such misalignments are a huge issue for AI safety. A better understanding of how children find loopholes could help us get a better handle on when and why machines misunderstand us. We see that loopholes are prevalent and consequential in society and everyday life, but there hasn't been a lot of research on them. There has been research on related topics, such as in the domain of pragmatic reasoning, exploring children's developing understanding of literal versus non-literal distinctions, and also on children's understanding of the letter and spirit of the law in moral reasoning. This research looks at how children evaluate people who break the letter but maintain the spirit of the rule, kind of the opposite of loophole behavior. Given that research on loophole behavior is scarce, we need data on how prevalent this behavior actually is in childhood and when it emerges. So I'll first present a parent survey of children's loophole behavior. Once we establish the existence of this phenomenon, a developmental and computational account is key, both to better understand its origins and the social cognitive mechanisms that support it, and to make contact with machine learning. To this end, I'll present an initial experiment exploring children's understanding of loopholes, and I'll conclude by sharing a sketch of a formal proposal that we are currently working on. We gave parents the same definition of loophole behavior I gave you, along with some examples in order to make sure they understood what we meant. And then we just asked them, does your child engage in loophole behavior? Participants were 260 parents on Prolific, who collectively had 425 children in total between the ages of 3 and 18. Parents could respond by selecting, no, my child has never engaged with loopholes, yes, they currently do, or yes, but previously, they no longer do. 60% of parents said that their children are current or previous loopholers. And if we look at the age distributions of these three groups, we see that the children who have never engaged with loopholes are the youngest group in red, current loopholers fall in the middle in green, and though there's quite a bit of variance, previous loopholers in blue fall toward the upper end of this age range. We can ask parents of current and previous loopholers, when did this behavior start? And both groups report that it began around 5 to 6 years of age. Given that parents of previous loopholers might have a fuzzier memory of this behavior, it's quite striking how similar these distributions are, suggesting that the emergence of loophole behavior might be quite memorable. We can further zoom in on these previous loopholers and ask when this behavior peaked and when it stopped. Parents report that it peaked around 7 to 8 and tapered off around 9 to 10. Of course, as I mentioned, loopholes do persist into adulthood, but children's tendency to exploit loopholes with their parents appears to decrease around 9 to 10 and into adolescence. We also invited parents to share examples of their children's loopholes, and they readily shared stories that were rich and spanned domains. Children exploited loopholes having to do with scalars, you need to do some reading, and the child reads 2 sentences, scope of generalization, no more Xbox tonight, and the child switches to PlayStation, indirect requests, can you put on your shoes, and the child says, yes, I can, but then does not put on their shoes. And many other examples having to do with reference, timing, number, and more. And all of this reflects the idea that finding loopholes in communication is a general cognitive capacity and is not specific to particular linguistic constructs or conceptual domains. A few takeaways. To our knowledge, this is the first survey to systematically investigate loophole behavior in parent-child interactions. We find that parents readily recognize and identify loophole behavior, and that loophole behavior is prevalent and diverse. We also now have a possible developmental trajectory, with loophole behavior emerging around 5 to 6 years of age, peaking around 7 to 8, and tapering off into adolescence, at least among parents and children. I'd like to take a moment to consider this age of onset because it's a bit curious. Before 5 to 6 years of age, children can already explicitly reason about others' true and false beliefs. This is also much later than when children first begin lying. But from 5 to 7 years, many things are changing. Though pragmatic reasoning begins in infancy, children's ability to spontaneously generate the relevant alternatives for a given utterance to make the appropriate implicature is improving. This is also the age when children start using and comprehending puns. As discussed, from 4 to 10 years, children's sensitivity to the letter-spirit duality of rules is increasing. Children's theory of mind is becoming more sophisticated, particularly their higher-order theory of mind, or others' beliefs about beliefs. And they are becoming more adept counterfactual and modal reasoners. Moving forward, we are curious to explore the relationship between the emergence of loophole behavior and these other social cognitive capacities. But so far, this has all been from the parents' point of view. What do children understand about loopholes? Now, there are many reasons why children might use loopholes, but we think a primary reason in parent-child interactions is to get out of trouble. When compliance is not that appealing, and non-compliance might upset the parent, the loophole lands children in the gray area in between. Since the child technically did what the parent said, even if it wasn't exactly what the parent meant, there's some room for plausible deniability that could mitigate punishment. In other words, the loophole can be a means to achieve one's own goals while decreasing the social costs that would be incurred from outright non-compliance. So we started our investigation by asking children how much trouble a loophole would get you into. We took the real-life stories parents provided in the survey and turned them into storybooks that I read to children over Zoom. So for example, here's a story about Mia, who was looking at a phone in bed, and her mother comes in and says, "It's time to put the phone down." Mia puts the phone down and keeps looking at it. And then I just asked children, how much trouble will Mia get into? And they could respond on a 4-point emoji scale from a lot of trouble to no trouble. Children received training on this scale before the experiment to make sure they could use it. So this is the loophole ending. This story could alternatively end in non-compliance, where Nia doesn't put the phone down and keeps looking at it, or compliance, where she puts the phone down and goes to sleep. In addition to this story, we had 4 others: Don't Jump on That Couch, You Can't Go Outside Alone, I Don't Want to See Anything on the Floor, and No More Xbox Tonight. Children saw 3 stories, 1 compliance, 1 loophole, and 1 non-compliance, and the particular stories they saw, the condition of each story, and the order of the conditions were counterbalanced. Due to the pandemic, we recruited a convenient sample of 24 to 10-year-olds, so this is a preliminary experiment. We also ran a pre-registered experiment with adults on Prolific to see what adults thought about these stories. Adults saw 9 stories, 3 of each type. So we'll look at both adults and children's evaluations of trouble. For children, we'll look at their responses altogether and then split into younger and older children by median age. Along the y-axis, 0 is no trouble and 3 is a lot of trouble. We find that both adults and children think loopholes will result in less trouble than non-compliance, but more trouble than compliance, and this distinction is present in both the younger and older age groups. There are some hints that this distinction might increase with age, but a larger, more diverse sample is needed to verify any developmental differences. Overall, though, 4 to 10-year-olds appear to distinguish loopholes from non-compliance in terms of trouble. Anecdotally, across the board, people find loophole stories funny. So as an additional exploratory measure, we explicitly asked adults how funny these stories were, and we coded children's own affective reactions, whether they laughed or smiled upon hearing the child protagonist's response to the parent's request. We find that adults and children consider loopholes funnier than either non-compliance or compliance. There are many hypotheses one could have about why exploring loopholes is funny, but regardless of why, the fact that children find them funny is further evidence that children recognize loopholes as distinct from these other behaviors. We find that children 4 to 10 years of age distinguish loophole behavior from non-compliance and compliance, both in terms of trouble and humor. Together with the developmental trajectory from the parent survey, we have some correlational evidence that children might begin producing loopholes around the age that they recognize them in others. And in addition to evaluating trouble, we also asked children for their explanations, and children provided rich explanations, spontaneously appealing to language ambiguity, conflicting goals, and underlying intentions to explain loophole behaviors. We are currently replicating and scaling up this experiment. We are also looking at when children predict others will engage with loopholes, and the loopholes children themselves generate for a given request. In addition to understanding loopholes more deeply, we are also exploring the ambiguity present when observing this behavior. On the surface, an intentional misunderstanding or loophole might look the same as a genuine misunderstanding. And this ambiguity might be particularly relevant and challenging for children with higher pragmatic uncertainty, such as children on the autism spectrum, who might more often genuinely misunderstand what their social partners want, and conversely, their social partners might more often misinterpret their honest confusion as a loophole, which could lead to miscommunication and social tension. We are exploring this with the Simon Center for the Social Brain, which funds my postdoc. We are also investigating misunderstandings between humans and machines, and are in the process of developing a computational framework for human loophole behavior to understand it more deeply. And I'd like to share a sketch of what we're thinking about. So our proposal has 3 ingredients: language understanding, rational planning, and goal alignment. In other words, a loophole-seeking child needs to understand what is being asked, what their own goals are, and what the trade-off is between their goals and this other person's. For the first ingredient, you need some mapping between an utterance and possible meanings. This is the domain of pragmatic reasoning, and in particular, the Rational Speech Act framework, which is a probabilistic theory of language understanding where the listener and speaker collaborate to reason about a space of possible meanings. Here the speaker is communicating a goal or utility that they want the listener to adopt, such as stop jumping on any and all couches. The listener then makes a plan to achieve the speaker's goal, but also to achieve their own goal, which they can weight and integrate with the speaker's according to joint planning. Now, if the listener's goals are aligned with the speaker's, the listener can plan a cooperative, compliant act. But if goals are misaligned and non-compliance is costly, the listener might seek out a loophole. That is, they might consider a less likely alternative interpretation of the speaker's utterance and see what would result from joint planning if the speaker had meant this alternative. For example, if the speaker had meant to only stop jumping on that specific couch, then jumping on the other couch would be a viable response. We are in the process of implementing this model and will use it to guide future experiments. More broadly, loophole behavior highlights two central challenges of cooperation. Goal communication, goals must be inferred from others' ambiguous words and actions, and goal alignment. Though humans are motivated to cooperate, our goals do not always align with others. In my own work, I've shown how even young children can recruit their knowledge of the world and other people to decide how best to help. Loopholes provide new insight into children's cooperative decision-making, particularly how they handle situations where they don't want to cooperate but can't easily refuse. In the same way that visual illusions shed light on the implicit assumptions and computations of the visual system, loopholes offer a different lens for the typical workings of cooperation and communication. A better understanding of the psychological processes that let even young humans intuitively solve goal communication and subvert it could inform the design of safer, intelligent machines that better understand what we mean and potentially improve human-human communication across development and neurodiversity. I want to thank my collaborators. The work on machine loopholes and the modeling is with Elena Glassman and Jean Mahovy. I'd like to thank my lab members, my funding, the families and children who participated, and all of you for listening. I look forward to your questions.